What if absolute power didn't corrupt absolutely? It just made things weird. From a king who crowned his horse to a queen who held mock weddings in ice palaces, history's most powerful rulers weren't just commanding, they were completely unhinged. These are not tales of war or diplomacy, these are bedtime stories soaked in perfume, blood, and sheer royal lunacy. 49 monarchs, 49 bizarre obsessions, and one unsettling truth: the higher the crown, the stranger the soul. So buckle in. The royal court isn't just Medit's magnificent. Before we dive headfirst into royal madness, hit that subscribe button if you crave stories that history books politely ignore. And, while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what ungodly hour is it right now? Midnight in Manila? 3 a.m. in Ohio? We see you, insomniacs and curiosity junkies. Let's get weird. King Henry III of England. It's hard to explain what kind of man keeps a polar bear in the Tower of London and lets it go fishing in the Thames like a frosty suburban dad on his day off. But King Henry III of England wasn't like most people. He was the sort of king who believed that royal dignity was best expressed by chaining a half-ton apex predator to the bank of the river and letting it take majestic swan dives into the filthiest waterway in Europe. This was not just for show. No, Henry had received the bear as a gift from the King of Norway, as you do when you're a medieval monarch with more ceremonial titles than surviving teeth. While most kings might have penned a polite thank you note or at least confined the animal to a royal menagerie, Henry decided the bear needed exercise. So, he ordered the construction of a long leash and let it swim in the Thames, presumably dodging boats, sewage, and the occasional body, all while catching its own dinner like some furry Norse-accented deity. This was a man whose reign was defined by fiscal crises, baronial revolts, and architectural projects funded by divine guilt and high taxes. Yet here he was, micromanaging the fishing habits of a polar bear in the middle of political upheaval. One could imagine the court's daily debates: should we raise taxes, reform feudal land laws, or design a better swim harness for Bjorn the royal bear? In retrospect, Henry III's obsession with exotic animals might seem like an early form of diplomatic zoophilia, or maybe just the behavior of someone who found humans too exhausting. Either way, it set the tone. English monarchs would henceforth be judged not only by their governance but by how weirdly they treated animals. And speaking of kings who cheered at the deaths of their own siblings, King Afonso VI of Portugal. They say family is everything unless you're King Afonso VI of Portugal, in which case family was a recurring series of funerals you celebrated like surprise birthday parties. When his older siblings died, Afonso didn't grieve. He shouted, "Hooray!" a reaction so emotionally jarring that it made even the most hardened courtiers shuffle uncomfortably in their tights. To be fair, Afonso didn't exactly come from an emotionally balanced household. Born partially paralyzed, he was never expected to rule. But fate, syphilis, and some conveniently timed deaths cleared his path to the throne. His physical limitations were compounded by something far murkier: his mental state. Records from the time suggest he was wildly unstable, paranoid, and prone to violent outbursts. He liked war, but only from a distance. He played politics like a bored child, pulling wings off flies casually, clumsily, and with little regard for the consequences. His reign was marked by erratic behavior, constant scheming, and a total disinterest in leadership beyond its ceremonial perks. He partied like a monarch possessed, hosted orgies during plagues, and once tried to ride a horse backward through a cathedral. For fun. Eventually, his own mother and brother staged what could generously be called an intervention but really was a royal coup. They declared him unfit and locked him away in a luxurious exile where he lived out his remaining days as a sort of tragicomic footnote, a king who lost his crown not in battle, but to the sheer exhaustion of everyone around him. And yet, despite it all, he left behind a legend. The king who applauded death like it was an encore. Now, imagine that energy, but angrier, bloodier, and with sisters for victims. King Charles IX of France. There's something unsettling about a teenage king with a god complex, a sword, and unresolved mother issues. Enter King Charles IX of Francia, man whose hobbies included hunting, ruling, and spontaneous episodes of sadistic violence. He didn't just rule over France during one of its bloodiest religious wars. He actively added to the bloodshed like it was a personal passion project. Charles had been thrust onto the throne too early, manipulated by his mother, Catherine de' Medici, and surrounded by religious tension like a tinderbox soaked in gasoline. But even accounting for political chaos and Huguenot paranoia, Charles stood out. He wasn't merely unstable. He was a storm disguised as a boy king. He flew into fits of rage at court, attacking servants, nobles, and occasionally his own family. It's said that he once physically assaulted his sisters during one of his infamous episodes, then retreated to his chambers to weep uncontrollably. His psychological torment was a public spectacle-ione minute charming, the next feral. But no single act defines him more than the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Though his mother masterminded the plan, Charles signed off on it, then reportedly stood at a palace window, firing a musket into the fleeing crowd of Protestants himself. Thousands were butchered in the streets. Charles, meanwhile, developed a hacking cough, insomnia, and a growing sense of dread. He began to suspect he was being poisoned by ghosts, by God, by guilt, maybe all three. He died young, delirious, and coughing blood, his final days marked by visions of the dead and a regret too late to matter. France remembered him not as a monarch, but as a moral implosion in a velvet doublet. And yet, the bloodiest kings aren't always the ones on battlefields. Sometimes they're in marble halls, stabbing flies with pens. Emperor Domitian of Rome. He ruled Rome with the paranoia of a cornered animal and the emotional stability of a man who found power too soon and sanity too late. Emperor Domitian, the last of the Flavian emperors, was not merely feared, he was avoided, tiptoed around, gossiped about in whispers. Officially, he styled himself as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, which tells you just how fragile his ego was. Unofficially, his favorite pastime was catching flies and stabbing them with a stylus. Picture that. The Emperor of Rome, Lord of the greatest empire in the known world, holed up in a room, quietly skewering insects with the same precision others used for tax records. It was a pastime that blended the childish with the psychotic trivial, pointless, and yet deeply telling. Domitian didn't just kill time, he executed it with a flourish of cruelty. His fly-piercing hobby was merely a metaphor for his rule. If you crossed him, if you blinked wrong, breathed too loud, or if your horoscope didn't align with his, you were likely to disappear. He reinvented paranoia into imperial policy, launching purges so thorough they became bureaucratic routines. Senators died in waves, philosophers vanished, poets stopped rhyming. Even statues began to sweat under his gaze. Domitian would walk marble corridors alone, speaking to himself, whispering threats to shadows. He trusted no one, not his generals, not his wife, not his own reflection. He had spies watching spies, informants tracking informants. He was obsessed with betrayal and delighted in preemptively punishing it. And yet, he was oddly efficient. The treasury improved, public works expanded. The army was paid on time. The paradox of Domitian was this: his tyranny worked until it didn't. Eventually, even the most bootlicking elites decided they preferred a world without fly stabbing in the imperial schedule. He was assassinated by a conspiracy of courtiers and guards, betrayed in exactly the way he had always expected. The emperor who feared everyone was, in the end, exactly right. And speaking of leaders who couldn't keep their hands to themselves, 4 monarchs in, and we've already had a bear on a leash, a sibling celebration, a royal temper tantrum, and a fly-hunting emperor. If you're still with us, you clearly have excellent taste in chaos. Don't forget to subscribe for more strange history you won't find in school books. And tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from and what time is it right now? Because let's be honest, no one watches this kind of madness at noon. King Christian VII of Denmark. The Danish court had many problems in the 18th century. Economic reform, political instability, the Enlightenment breathing down its neck. But its biggest problem? King Christian VII couldn't stop masturbating. Publicly, constantly, and aggressively. Christian wasn't just eccentric. He was mentally unlikely, schizophrenic, possibly autistic, certainly traumatized. He was crowned at age 17, but he never truly ruled. His condition left him emotionally unstable, given to mood swings, self-harm, and compulsive behavior. Which brings us to the chronic masturbation, a fact so widely documented that even contemporary observers wrote about it with exhausted frankness, as if chronic self-pleasure was just another economic indicator. He would disappear from meetings to indulge in his habit, sometimes under the table, sometimes not even bothering with the pretense. Foreign dignitaries left Denmark clutching handkerchiefs and trauma. There's a famous anecdote in which Christian abruptly slapped a visiting noble across the face mid-conversation because he didn't like being interrupted. His court, understandably, panicked. Power was quietly handed to his physician, Johann Friedrich Struensee, a radical Enlightenment thinker who tried to govern through policy and reform, while the king wandered palace halls mumbling and touching himself. Struensee banned torture, improved education, and implemented freedom of the press. He also began an affair with Christian's wife, because apparently no one in Denmark knew how to chill. Eventually, the court had enough of this intellectual ménage à trois. Struensee was arrested and executed. Christian was declared unfit and kept alive as a ceremonial puppet. He would live for decades, occasionally lucid, often not, always under watch. He never really regained authority, but he never fully disappeared either. Like a malfunctioning clock that still ticks, unblinking and unfixable. Which brings us to another monarch whose instability wasn't limited to just one palace or one tragedy, but 280 of them, drowned in the Bosphorus. Sultan Ibrahim I of the Ottoman Empire, the Mad Sultan. Some kings go mad quietly. Sultan Ibrahim I of the Ottoman Empire preferred spectacle. Nicknamed the Mad, his reign was a fever dream of paranoia, indulgence, and cruelty, all wrapped in silk and scented oils. He emerged from a life of imprisonment in the Kafes, the Ottoman cage designed to isolate potential heirs, and walked straight into power like a ghost staggering into daylight. Ibrahim had never known normal human interaction. His formative years were spent in solitary confinement, surrounded by whispers and eunuchs. When his brother died and he ascended the throne, the empire held its breath. But what followed was not roulette, was rupture. At first, he surrounded himself with women, hundreds. His harem swelled to nearly 300 concubines, whom he treated with an alternating mix of obsession and fear. He reportedly became convinced that one of them had committed adultery. So he did what any completely rational, sexually traumatized absolute monarch would do. He ordered all 280 concubines to be tied up in sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus. The act was so chilling, so methodical, that even hardened Ottoman courtiers flinched. It wasn't justice. It wasn't politics. It was pure, deranged Powera tantrum scaled to empire-size horror. Ibrahim's whims didn't stop there. He declared war based on dreams, appointed animals to administrative roles, and once demanded a fur-lined room in the middle of summer because he liked how it felt on his skin. His favorite concubine, known as Sugar Cube, was given an absurd amount of influence over state affairs, further alienating his advisors. Eventually, his mother and the court elites staged a coup. Like many mad rulers, Ibrahim didn't go out in a blaze of glory. He was strangled quietly, out of sight, like an unwanted secret. The empire moved on. The waters of the Bosphorus remained silent. And yet, if you listen closely, they say you can still hear the splash of 280 sack sand, the echo of madness that stains empires long after they fall. Next, one Russian empress, a freezing wedding, and a forced honeymoon in an ice palace. Empress Anna Ivanovna of Russia. If your idea of royal romance includes an ice palace, forced cross-dressing, and a dwarf wedding in sub-zero temperatures, congratulations. You may have just channeled the ghost of Empress Anna Ivanovna of Russia. Her reign was a 10-year snowstorm of humiliation rituals, pettiness as policy, and aristocratic cruelty so elaborate it felt like state-funded performance art. Anna was the niece of Peter the Great and took the Russian throne in 1730, not through brilliance or vision, but because the nobility assumed she'd be easy to control. She proved them wrong in the worst possible way. Almost immediately, she transformed the imperial court into a stage for her darkest amusements. Her power plays were less about governance and more about degradation, especially of those who defied or displeased her. Take, for example, her infamous ice palace stunt. After learning that one of her court members had secretly married without her permission, she decided to exact a punishment so bizarre it bordered on myth. She ordered the man along with a physically deformed female courtier to be married in a ceremony where every guest had to arrive dressed as a chicken or other barnyard animal. Then she constructed a full-scale palace out of ice on the frozen Neva River and commanded the newlyweds to spend their wedding night inside. No blankets, no heat, no escape. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Power wasn't just cold, was theatrical, merciless, and deeply personal. Anna also enjoyed making her nobles crawl on their hands and knees, bark like dogs, or stand in corners during court dinners. It was said that she laughed uproariously at these humiliations, sipping imported wines while the Russian elite fumbled in straw wigs and ridiculous costumes. Her rule, while politically stagnant, was psychologically revelatory. This was not a woman interested in legacy. She was interested in watching the world squirm beneath her. After her death, her legacy was quietly swept under the snowdrifts of Russian history, too cruel to be revered, too bizarre to forget. But at least she didn't picnic with naked men under the moonlight, unlike the king waiting in the Bavarian wings, King Ludwig II of Bavaria. Ludwig II was a man born into the wrong dimension. The King of Bavaria ruled during the late 19th century, but he lived emotionally somewhere between Wagnerian opera and Gothic hallucination. He wasn't so much a monarch as he was a dreamer with a crown detached from politics, allergic to responsibility, and obsessed with beauty to the point of ruin. He rarely held council meetings and avoided his ministers like they carried contagious boredom. Instead, Ludwig poured his energies into building castles that looked like fever dreams carved into alpine stone. Neuschwanstein, his most famous creation, was less a fortress and more a shrine to fantasy, adorned with murals of swans, saints, and scenes from Wagner's operas. It was essentially a real estate tribute to his musical idol, whom he idolized with the fervor of a teenage groupie. But the weird didn't stop at architecture. Ludwig was famously nocturnal, taking his meals at night and sleeping during the day. He arranged moonlight sleigh rides through the forest, with footmen dressed as medieval knights holding torches. Sometimes he brought along companions, naked male dancers, hired for their looks and their silence, who frolicked in moonlight as the lonely king watched from a velvet-draped sleigh. He also paid for private opera performances attended only by himself. No audience, no applause, just Ludwig in the dark, weeping silently to arias no one else would hear. Financially, this fantasy life bankrupted the state. His ministers eventually declared him insane and deposed him. 2 days later, Ludwig's body was found floating in Lake Starnberg, alongside the doctor who had diagnosed him. Officially, it was ruled a suicide. Unofficially, no one believes that. His legacy endures in stone and silence, in the echoes of empty castles, and in a moonlit sleigh cutting through the snow, heading toward nothing. And then there was the king who thought trees were diplomats and tried to shake hands with one, King George III of the United Kingdom. He ruled through revolution, rebellion, and regency. But history remembers King George III for one thing above all. He went mad. Not in the usual tyrant way, no orgies, no dungeons, no rivers of blood. George's madness was quieter, more colorful, and occasionally tree-based. He believed at times that he could converse with oak trees, not metaphorically, literally. There are accounts deadpan, British, and thoroughly alarmed of the king attempting to shake hands with the branches of Windsor oaks, greeting them as long-lost ambassadors. And then there was the urine. Historians now suspect he suffered from porphyria, a metabolic disorder that can cause hallucinations and discoloration of the urine. Contemporary accounts describe it as blue, red, or even purple-making. George III, possibly the only monarch in history whose bathroom visits could be mistaken for an art installation. But it wasn't just the hallucinations. During his worst episodes, George would talk non-stop for hours, sometimes for days, jumping from subject to subject, quoting the Bible, babbling about military affairs, then weeping uncontrollably. He once wrote a 400-word sentence without punctuation, which is either a cry for help or the first draft of modernist literature. Despite all this, George wasn't evil. He was sincere, devout, and genuinely well-meaning. That might be what makes his unraveling so tragic. He tried to be a conscientious ruler, he just couldn't stop his brain from melting. Eventually, he was deemed unfit and locked away in Windsor Castle, where he lived in declining obscurity for 9 years, blind, deaf, and utterly detached from the world he once ruled. And yet, even in his madness, he believed in the system. He never tried to stage a comeback. He just kept talking to trees. Which is more than can be said for the next king who preferred to have dinner with the dying, King Vlad III, Dracula of Wallachia, the Impaler. He didn't just punish his enemies, he rearranged the topography of fear. King Vlad III of Wallachia Dracula, if your nasty wasn't content with executions, prisons, or symbolic justice. No. Vlad preferred his punishments tall, slow, and pointed. His legacy? A forest of the impaled, a kingdom paved with screams, a dinner party from hell where the centerpiece was always agony. To understand Vlad is to confront a man who turned torture into choreography. His favorite method was, of course, impalement, not the sharp, swift kind. That would be merciful. Vlad's version was deliberately engineered for maximum suffering. Victims were skewered lengthwise, the stake carefully lubricated and inserted to avoid vital organs, so they would remain alive screaming for hours or even days. These displays weren't hidden, they were theatrical, fields of the dead arranged in geometric patterns, mile-long pathways lined with twitching, groaning bodies, death as decoration. One of his most infamous feasts took place amid hundreds of the impaled. He sat calmly, eating bread and meat while his guests gagged. According to some accounts, he dipped his bread in the blood of the dying, more metaphorical than literal, perhaps, but the image sticks because it feels disturbingly plausible. That's how Vlad worked, not just physically violent, but psychologically exhaustive, a PR genius of terror. And yet, he wasn't entirely irrational. Wallachia was a volatile regiona, fragile buffer between the Christian West and the Ottoman Empire. Vlad ruled with brutality, yes, but also with surgical intent. He kept crime virtually non-existent. Merchants reported that a purse left on the road would remain untouched for days. Why? Because the penalty for theft was a slow, scenic impalement. Western leaders were torn. Some praised him as a defender of Christendom. Others wrote him off as a blood-drunk madman. But one thing was certain. He was not a myth. He was worse than that. He was real. And if Vlad's reign was one long horror opera, the next emperor was a tragicomic farce with a horse in the Senate and soldiers stabbing the sea. Emperor Caligula of Rome. Madness in Rome was rarely subtle, and Caligula was never interested in subtlety. He burst into power like a fever dream, wearing laurel and dripping contempt. For a brief, misleading moment, he was loved young, charismatic, the heir who would revive the empire. Then he got sick, possibly poisoned, definitely changed. What emerged from the illness was not a ruler, but a walking hallucination with a god complex and a flair for satire-level politics. Caligula made his horse, Incitatus, a priest. Then he made him a consul. The horse had a marble stall, an ivory manger, and servants. Whether this was a grand joke or a sincere appointment remains unclear. In either case, the Senate showed up and bowed to it. That's what fear does. It makes grown men curtsy to livestock. He declared war on the Seys, the sea. After a failed campaign in Britain, he marched his army to the shore and ordered them to stab the ocean. When they finished, he collected seashells and declared them the spoils of war. He then returned to Rome and paraded through the streets, flanked by prisoners of war who were, in fact, local fishermen dressed as Gauls. He was also intensely sexual in the way that only complete sociopaths can be. He allegedly slept with his sisters, auctioned off Senate wives at palace brothels, and turned the imperial palace into a revolving door of debasement. He believed he was a living god and demanded worship. Statues of Jupiter were altered to bear his likeness. He regularly spoke to the moon and thundered commands at Jupiter. Eventually, Rome had enough. Even tyrants can only joke about cutting senators' throats for so long. He was assassinated by his own guards. The Senate tried to erase him from history, but like all good horror stories, he lingered in the cultural bloodstream. And if Caligula was the bureaucratic antichrist of chaos, the next monarch took things in a different direction. Endless paperwork, obsessive architecture, and a life smothered by stone. King Philip II of Spain. If Caligula was a wildfire, King Philip II of Spain was a mausoleum. Cold, meticulous, and allergic to joy, Philip ruled from a fortress of paper and silence. Where other monarchs brandished swords or scepters, Philip wielded folders, thousands of them. He was obsessed with documents, requests, reports, petitions, declarations. He annotated everything, corrected margins, and personally answered letters down to the grammar. This wasn't delegation, it was compulsion. He spent more time with paper than people. His royal residence, El Escorial, wasn't just a palace. It was a stone symphony of control, part monastery, part tomb, part bureaucratic command center. Its corridors echoed not with laughter or diplomacy, but with the rustle of parchment and the scraping of quills. It had the architectural warmth of a sarcophagus. Philip lived in a cell-like room within it, surrounded by portraits of dead saints and bound by ritual. He rarely left. Even during times of war or national crisis, he preferred to command from the shadows, sending out memoranda like papal bulls. His policies were often brilliant, but emotionally hollow. He micromanaged the details of empire while neglecting the human cost. Spain's golden age? Built on gold, pulled from the Americas by slaves, shipped under royal orders, tallied by clerks, and blessed by a king who couldn't bear sunlight. Philip's personal life was equally grim. He married 4 times 2 of his wives, died young, 1 was politically arranged, and only 1 was reportedly loved. When his beloved son, Don Carlos, began showing signs of mental illness, Philip had him imprisoned in solitary confinement, where he later died under mysterious circumstances. Devotion was another obsession. Philip prayed obsessively, flagellated himself, and believed fervently in divine mission. He saw himself as a warrior of God, but one who fought with scrolls instead of swords. His world was precise, absolute, and airless. He left behind one of the largest empires in history. And yet, emotionally, his legacy is a whisper inside a vault. Up next, a queen who would have starved herself to death if her corset allowed it. Empress Elisabeth of Austria, Sisi. Beauty was her kingdom, and obsession her crown. Empress Elisabeth of Austria, known to the world as Sisi, was not your standard 19th century royal consort. She was a myth in motion, a melancholic goddess wandering the Habsburg court with a waist that never exceeded 19 inches and a gaze that often seemed aimed through people, not at them. Her life was half fairy tale, half slow-motion nervous breakdown held together by hairpins and hunger. Sisi's beauty regimen bordered on psychotic. She spent up to 3 hours a day having her floor-length hair dressed. It wasn't vanity, it was compulsion. Each strand was carefully inspected, each loose hair collected with religious intensity. Her waistline, the stuff of legend, was achieved through extreme corseting, brutal diets. She often lived on nothing but raw milk, oranges, and broth, and a punishing exercise routine that included horseback riding for hours and gymnastic rings installed in her rooms. She hated court life. She despised Vienna. She loathed her in-laws. Her husband, Emperor Franz Joseph, adored her, but that only made things worse. Sisi longed for freedom, for solitude, for the fantasy of escape she never actually found. She traveled obsessively, compulsively, endlessly across Europe and the Mediterranean, as if movement itself could exorcise the grief she carried. Her son, Crown Prince Rudolf, committed suicide in a murder-suicide pact at Meierling. After that, something inside her calcified. She wore mourning black for the rest of her life. She refused to be photographed. She wandered under umbrellas, even on cloudy days, to shield herself from view. She aged beautifully, but she made sure no one could witness it. Sisi became a ghost before she died, drifting through palaces, rail stations, and mental spirals like a shadow dressed in jet beads. Her end came via anarchist. She was stabbed in the heart by an Italian political fanatic who didn't even know who she was at first. She stumbled away, corseted so tightly that she didn't even realize she'd been mortally wounded until she collapsed and bled to death internally. And if Sisi was obsessed with staying young and alive forever, the next emperor was obsessed with making it happen on mercury pill at a time. Emperor Qin Shi Huang of China. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, was a man who couldn't die fast enough for his enemies or slow enough for himself. He was obsessed with immortality, terrified of assassination, and absolutely convinced that if he played the game right, death would blink first. Spoiler, it didn't. But not for lack of trying. He never slept in the same bed twice. His palaces were labyrinthine death traps for any would-be assassin, complete with fake doors, decoys, and guards, trained to kill first and ask questions in the afterlife. He consumed strange potions, followed charlatans claiming to have maps to the Isles of Immortals, and ingested elixirs filled with mercury. That's right, poisoned himself trying to live forever. His death, when it finally came, was ironic enough to be poetic. He died on a tour of the empire, his bloated corpse hidden in a carriage filled with rotting fish to mask the smell. His entourage didn't want the news out until they got back to the capital because even in death, Qin's power remained terrifying. But what he left behind might be even weirder. Beneath the earth, sealed for over 2 millennia, lies his terracotta army, thousands of life-size soldiers, horses, acrobats, and officials, all crafted to accompany him into the afterlife. His tomb, still largely unopened, is said to contain rivers of liquid mercury and a death trap so elaborate it could kill modern archaeologists. Indiana Jones would hesitate. He unified China through sheer brutality. He burned books, buried scholars, standardized weights and scripts, and built walls that became legends. And yet, he never trusted what he built. He was haunted by omens, hunted by death, and embalmed in irony. The emperor who wanted to live forever is now a permanent resident of myth sealed in toxic grandeur. And speaking of rulers with a magnetic attraction to crime, our next king didn't just rob people of dignity, he literally picked their pockets. King Farouk I of Egypt. King Farouk I didn't need to rob anyone. He was rich, royal, and wrapped in silk. But rob he did compulsively, gleefully, and often while shaking your hand. It wasn't kleptomania in the medical sense. It was a game, a power move, a way to say, I can take from you, and you'll still have to call me your majesty. Farouk ruled Egypt during the first half of the 20th century, a time of growing nationalism, deepening corruption, and uncomfortable colonial entanglements. He handled it all by doing as little governing as possible. Instead, he binged on food. He reportedly gained over 250 pounds, amassed one of the world's largest coin collections, and walked through Cairo incognito to see how the peasants lived, and sometimes steal from them. His pickpocketing wasn't symbolic. He once stole a watch from Winston Churchill. He enjoyed crashing parties, taking small objects, and watching people pretend not to notice. He loved fast cars, women, and expensive Teusches palace was stuffed with pinball machines, gold telephones, and naturally, stolen artifacts. When he wasn't looting his own country's history, he was hoarding it. His eating habits were legendary. He'd order entire tables of food only to eat a few bites. He was allergic to shame. His decadence reached comical levels. He had chefs on standby 24/7, imported ice cream from Europe, and had his own bakery just for eclairs. But Farouk's grip on the country was slippery. As Egypt modernized and militarized, he became a caricature of everything wrong with the monarchy. He called himself the last pharaoh, but the army called him a parasite. In 1952, a coup swept him out of power and into exile. He spent the rest of his life in Italy, broke in spirit but still full of éclairs. He died in a Roman restaurant, face down in a plate of food because, of course he did. Death by fork, more or less. Now let's meet a Scottish king who believed unicorn horns could heal, but wasn't above yanking out your teeth to find out. King James IV of Scotland. He believed in unicorns. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, he literally believed in unicorns. King James IV of Scotland, Renaissance man and battlefield corpse in waiting, was convinced that a unicorn's horn could neutralize poison. So he carried one around like a medieval EpiPen, just in case someone decided to assassinate him via soup. James IV ruled in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, during a time when alchemy and astrology were seen as legitimate branches of sciences, long as you didn't mind the occasional fatal explosion or celestial miscalculation. But even by the standards of the era, James was eccentric. He funded alchemical experiments, read Latin poetry, played musical instruments, and performed impromptu dental surgery on his subjects. Yes, dental surgery. The King of Scotland had a curious obsession with medicine, particularly the extraction of teeth. He reportedly paid volunteers, or coerced volunteers, to let him yank out their molars. He wasn't trained, of course, but that didn't matter. He had royal hands and a set of pliers. What could go wrong? In court, he was adored for his intellect, feared for his temper, and admired for his physicality. He was multilingual, fiercely devout, and surprisingly self-aware. After his role in a failed rebellion against his father, he wore an iron chain around his waist for the rest of his life as penance, adding weight to it each year. But for all his quirks and quirksome faith in unicorn relics, James died doing the one thing kings probably shouldn't, invading England. At the Battle of Flodden in 1513, he led his army across the border and was promptly killed in battle, becoming the last British monarch to die on the battlefield. A man who believed in horned beasts, wielded forceps, and went to war with poetic flair, only to become a cautionary tale buried under mud and irony. And now, from a unicorn-chasing dentist to a monarch who weaponized seduction and broke his kingdom in the process. King John of England. If King John had a hobby, it was making enemies. If he had a passion, it was seduction, especially of women already married to the very men he relied on to keep his throne. This was not just politically short-sighted, it was catastrophic. John, younger brother of Richard the Lionheart and the villain of every Robin Hood legend, treated loyalty like a napkin used, discarded, and only occasionally remembered. His reign was defined by distrust, betrayal, and sexually charged chaos. John's court wasn't just a nest of political scheming, it was a rolling bedroom drama, a medieval soap opera complete with jealous husbands, furious barons, and a king who thought monogamy was for peasants. He seduced the wives and daughters of his nobles, often under the pretext of political hospitality. Once they were in his chambers, the hospitality turned invasive. Contemporary chronicler 7, the ones trying to be politet, described his lustful inclinations with exhausted horror. It wasn't romance. It was strategic libido, weaponized for leverage, pleasure, and punishment. The barons, predictably, hated him for it, but his other policies didn't help either. He lost lands in France, taxed the nobles into fury, and went to war with the church at one point, getting himself excommunicated. That takes effort. You have to try to be that disliked. His legacy, ironically, includes one of the most important legal documents in history, the Magna Carta. Not because he was enlightened, but because his barons forced it down his throat after yet another wave of betrayal. Even then, He tried to wiggle out of it almost immediately. John died in 1216, supposedly from dysentery, possibly from poison. Either way, his last days were spent sick, alone, and reportedly robbed by his own servants. Not the stuff of heroic ballads, more like a cautionary tale about power, lust, and how not to sleep with your own support structure. So if King John weaponized the bedroom, the next queen weaponized Painon herself in the name of God. Queen Isabella, the first of Castile. To say Isabella of Castile was devout would be like calling the sun warm. She didn't just practice Catholicism, she wielded it like a dagger, a crown, and a reason to bleed. This was the queen who funded Columbus's voyage but also launched the Spanish Inquisition, a woman of empire and agony who believed suffering was a necessary form of proof. Isabella ruled jointly with Ferdinand of Aragon, unifying Spain through strategic marriage, ruthless politics, and holy war. But beneath the steel and silk of her rule, there was a current of religious self-destruction. She believed deeply in penance and not the light kind. Isabella practiced self-flagellation. She whipped herself in private, striking her back to purge sin and draw closer to the divine. Her blood was a form of prayer. This wasn't for show. It wasn't performative. It was private, habitual, and sincere. Her inner life was as severe as her outer policy. She fasted obsessively, prayed for hours, and fixated on personal purity while commanding religious purges in the name of orthodoxy. And oh, the Inquisition. She and Ferdinand didn't invent it, but they formalized it into something monstrous. Jews and Muslims were expelled, converted under duress, or tortured in pursuit of truth. Isabella saw this as holy duty, a moral cleaning, a spiritual audit of the soul of Spain. She was also a meticulous ruler. She micromanaged state matters, read dispatches, and insisted on being fully briefed there for queens of the time. Her devotion extended beyond faith into governance. She worked herself toward exhaustion, convinced that the queen must be the nation's first servant, even if that meant bleeding in private chambers between diplomatic sessions. Her legacy is twisted: unification, exploration, genocide, faith, pain. She helped birth both an empire and an inquisition. Her conscience was heavy, but she carried it with pride. And speaking of prideful rulers with a scientific streak, the next emperor tried to raise children in silence just to see what language God had given them. King Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire. They called him Stupor Mundith, Wonder of the World. But for King Frederick II, emperor, polyglot, atheist, poet, falcon breeder, and possibly the most bizarre experimentalist in medieval Europe, that title didn't even scratch the surface. Frederick wasn't just curious, was obsessive, clinical, and utterly incapable of letting an idea go, no matter how cruel or metaphysically questionable. Take, for example, his divine language experiment. Frederick wanted to know what language humans would speak if they were never taught what speech, if any, came from God alone. So he arranged a chilling study. He ordered a group of infants raised in complete silence. No speaking, no cooing, no lullabies. Nurses were instructed to feed and clean the babies, but never to speak or comfort them. No affection, no human contact beyond survival. His hypothesis? That the children would grow up speaking the language of Adam Hebrew, Arabic, Latin, or perhaps something even more celestial. The result? Every child died. Not because they weren't fed or clothed, but because they weren't loved. Frederick discovered something profound, though whether he realized it is unclear. Without human connection, we don't just grow up strange. We don't grow up at all. And yet, The emperor who ran lethal language experiments was also a patron of the arts, sciences, and philosophy. He corresponded with Muslim scholars, debated theology with popes, and usually won, and wrote a manual on falconry so thorough it's still respected by ornithologists today. He was excommunicated twice, not for cruelty, but for being too independent, too modern, too suspiciously secular. The papacy hated him. His nobles didn't trust him. His enemies feared him. And history can't quite place him. He died in his 50s, likely of dysentery, surrounded by men who didn't understand him and legends that never stopped growing. A man centuries ahead of his time, if only time had been ready. But from an emperor fascinated by silence, we now turn to one who embraced noise, color, scandal, and full-blown gender chaos. Emperor Elagabalus of Rome. Imagine, if you will, a 14-year-old boy who rises to power as Emperor of Rome and promptly turns the imperial palace into something between a drag show, a sacrificial temple, and a reality television meltdown. That was Elagabalus, Rome's wildest teenage ruler, and possibly its most controversial queer icon. Born in Syria, Elagabalus brought with him the worship of a sun god called Elagabal, whom he tried to install as the chief deity of Rome. This involved moving sacred relics, desecrating traditional altars, and forcing senators to attend bizarre rituals that involved dancing, blood, and golden chariots pulled by naked women. The old gods didn't take kindly to the substitution, neither did the Senate. But religion was only half the spectacle. Elagabalus blurred gender, dressed in women's clothes, wore makeup, and preferred to be addressed as a lady. He reportedly married 5 times, once to a Vestal virgin, a scandal in itself, and at least twice to men. One of his male partners was a chariot driver named Hierocles, whom Elagabalus referred to as his husband. He also offered money to physicians who could provide him with female genitalia, essentially attempting the world's first recorded gender reassignment surgery. This was not just eccentricity, it was full-scale revolt against Roman norms, pushed to theatrical extremes. He released snakes into public crowds for fun. He drowned guests in rose petals. He scattered jewels across banquet floors and mocked anyone who scrambled to pick them up. The Roman elite were horrified. Religious conservatives, military leaders, and even his own grandmother conspired to remove him. Eventually, the Praetorian Guard had enough. Elagabalus was assassinated at age 18, his mutilated body dragged through the streets and dumped in the Tiber River like yesterday's blasphemy. History tried to erase him, but Elagabalus has endured as a figure of radical defiance, wild, excessive, unapologetic. And from a teenage god-emperor with a penchant for petals, we move to a French king who would have rather been picking locks than picking wars. That's 20 monarchs down, 20 deeply weird, occasionally unbathed, often unhinged royal souls. If you've made it this far, your curiosity is clearly incurable. So go ahead and subscribe, we've still got decades of dysfunction to dig through. And while you're here, tell us, where are you watching from, and what time is it? Are you on a midnight history spiral in Nairobi, or listening to royal scandals over breakfast in Vancouver? We want to know who else is awake in this corner of the timeline. King Louis XVI of France. While France burned with revolution, King Louis XVI was in his workshop, playing with locks. Not metaphors, actual locks, tumblers, keys, hinges. The man was obsessed with locksmithing and carpentry, two trades that, ironically, could have helped him escape the guillotine if he'd taken them seriously as survival skills instead of hobbies. Louis wasn't stupid, but he was Miss Castin, awkward, indecisive, deeply introverted man born into a time that demanded charisma, cunning, and the ability to pretend you cared. He preferred solitude to ceremony, tools to titles, and mechanics to monarchy. As court life swirled with scandal, and pamphlets smeared his name across Paris, Louis built cabinets and tinkered with mechanisms, blissfully disconnected from the rising tide. He kept detailed journals mostly empty, often recording only what he ate, or that nothing happened. Even on the day the Bastille was stormed, he famously wrote, "Rien, nothing." The revolutionaries could have used that entry as a recruitment poster. When things got truly bad, he tried to flee. With his wife, Marie Antoinette, and their children in tow, they loaded into a carriage and attempted to escape the growing chaos. They were caught at Varennes, recognized by a postman. It was the locksmith king's final irony, caught because someone else recognized his face better than he understood his role. He was brought back to Paris under guard, put on trial for treason, and sentenced to death. His last words were drowned out by the drum roll as the guillotine dropped. Louis XVI left behind a legacy of contradictions, a monarch more suited to a shed than a throne, a man who could craft complex locks but couldn't unlock the mystery of his own doomed rule. And next comes an emperor who ruled from brothels, built fantasy towns, and left governance to the eunuchs. Because why not? Emperor Zhengde of China. Some emperors tried to govern, some at least pretend, but the Zhengde emperor of Ming Dynasty China didn't bother with either. He treated the Forbidden City like a theater set, filled it with jesters and eunuchs, and spent most of his reign drunk on fantasy literally and politically. Zhengde, who came to power at just 14, seemed allergic to the concept of imperial responsibility. Rather than deal with bureaucrats and ministers, he constructed elaborate mock cities inside his palace grounds, complete with fake marketplaces, inns, and streets. There, he would play dress-up as a commoner or a general named Zhu Xuan. Everyone had to go along with the bit. If he was Zhu Shu, you couldn't call him emperor. That would ruin the game. When that wasn't enough, he left the palace entirely and hit the road in full cosplay, traveling the countryside in disguise, visiting brothels, and crashing villages like a royal tourist on a bender. He once fell off his boat while drunk during a nighttime trip down the Grand Canal and nearly drowned. The Emperor of China rescued like a drunken fisherman. He also surrounded himself with eunuchs who functioned less like aides and more like party planners and damage control specialists. One eunuch, Liu Jin, became so powerful under Zhengde's favor that he essentially ran the empire for a stretch until he was eventually arrested, tortured, and executed for corruption. Zhengde, of course, barely noticed. One of his most infamous stunts was capturing a wild, tiger bare-handed, he claimed, and parading it through the court. Historians are still trying to decide if this actually happened or if it was just one of the tall tales Zhengde demanded be added to the record. He died young, at 29, after falling ill from yet another drunken escapade. The empire breathed a sigh of relief. The brothel towns inside the palace were shut down. The fake cities were dismantled. But the image of an emperor playing make-believe while the country groaned under neglect, that lingered. Which brings us neatly to another monarch with a very real obsession, though not with fantasy, but with extreme height. King Friedrich Wilhelm I of Prussia. Friedrich Wilhelm, I didn't want an army. He wanted aesthetics. Specifically, tall ones. The soldier king of Prussia had a militaristic fetish for height, so intense it turned into policy. He built an elite regiment of colossal men known as the Potsdam Giants, and he would stop at nothing to get them. These weren't just soldiers, they were trophies. Friedrich Wilhelm paid families for their tall sons. He bribed foreign leaders to send over their most statuesque subjects. He even attempted to breed tall people by marrying off his giants to tall women, hoping for the perfect 6-foot heir. Height wasn't just admired, it was national currency. Some were recruited, many were kidnapped. Tall men disappeared across Europe, waking up in Prussia with uniforms already tailored. Those too short to serve in his regular army were forced into civilian life, but the tall were whisked away like golden retrievers at a dog show. Ironically, Friedrich Wilhelm himself was only about 5'5". He ran the kingdom like a man overcompensating, and perhaps he was. He was also notorious for violent outbursts, especially toward his son, the future Frederick the Great. The two clashed over everything. Friedrich Wilhelm wanted military obedience. His son wanted to read poetry and play the flute. At one point, the king caught Frederick trying to flee to England and had his accomplice, and possible lover, executed right in front of him. But for all his cruelty, Friedrich Wilhelm was no fool. He transformed Prussia into a streamlined, financially stable, hyper-efficient state. He cut waste, built infrastructure, and between slap attacks and forced marriages actually modernized the military. Still, the image that remains isn't that of a reformer. It's of a man towering over his court of involuntary basketball players, measuring patriotism by the inch. And next comes a king who had plenty of wives but never made enough music about them. Let's meet the singing, sonnet-writing tyrant of England. King Henry VIII of England. He's famous for the wives, 6 of them, 2 beheaded, all part of a marital carousel that spun around divorce, death, and dynastic paranoia. But beneath the carnage and the split from the Catholic Church, King Henry VIII was, weirdly enough, a romantic. A composer, a poet. A man who could write a sweet love song before turning around and executing the subject of it. Henry was an artistic soul trapped in a tyrant's body. He played the lute, sang, and wrote music, most notably the hymn, "Pastime with Good Company," a jaunty little tune that feels oddly wholesome coming from a guy who invented his own church so he could remarry more efficiently. He also wrote sonnets, though most of them read like breakup letters with a body count. The contradiction ran deep. Henry could be gallant and charming one moment, then monstrous the next. He wooed Anne Boleyn with poetry, courtly dances, and promises. Then, when she failed to produce a male heir, he had her arrested, tried on absurd charges of adultery and witchcraft, and beheaded. He mourned her by immediately proposing to someone else. As he aged, his body swelled, his temper worsened, and his injuries compounded most famously an infected leg wound that never healed, and reportedly stank so badly that courtiers had to suppress gagging in his presence. His paranoia spiraled. Advisors were executed for looking at him wrong. He became convinced that only he could save England even, as he slowly turned it into a state of institutionalized gaslighting and religious whiplash. And yet, he was deeply insecure. He needed admiration. He surrounded himself with flatterers and artists. His palaces were filled with music. His self-image was painted into immortality by Hans Holbein, robust, commanding, impossibly masculine. It was all theater, a carefully constructed lie. A king who wrote verses, murdered lovers, and thought the body could be sacrificed if the legend survived. And from a king who sang his feelings, we moved to one who stank with them literally, because bathing was apparently just too modern for him. King James VI and I of Scotland and England. King James VI of Scotland, who also became James I of England after uniting the crowns, had a mind that devoured theology, witchcraft, political theory, and paranoia in equal measure. But his body? Not so much. James had an unshakable aversion to water and a troubling lack of affection for soap. He bathed, according to most accounts, Almost never. And when he did change clothes, it was reportedly because his courtiers forced the issue, not because he thought cleanliness might, say, keep him alive longer. He once bragged that he had never washed his hands. He also didn't believe in the usefulness of bathing, claiming that it opened the pores to disease. Which is technically true, if your idea of disease prevention includes layering filth like medieval armor. Despite his personal hygiene or lack thereof, James was remarkably intellectual. He wrote treatises on monarchy, witchcraft, demonology, which helped ignite the English witch trials, and even the divine right of kings. He was the original "it's not a bug, it's a feature" guy of absolute monarchy. And yet, while he could out-debate theologians and scholars, he still regularly drooled during public events and had a tongue so oversized that it made speech difficult. His enemies said he waddled like a duck and smelled like a barn. He had a habit of leaning into his favorites, usually handsome young men, whom he lavished with gifts, titles, and questionable levels of affection. His relationships with Robert Carr, and later George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, were the source of endless gossip. Was it love? Was it political manipulation? Was it just James being James, clueless, clinging, and wrapped in 17 layers of unwashed linen? He ruled for decades, survived gunpowder plots, and left behind the King James Bible, perhaps the most influential English-language work in history. Not bad for a man who smelled like fermented wool. But if James was tormented by the threat of invisible evil, the next queen was haunted by something far more visceral, her own soul. Queen Maria I of Portugal, the Mad. Queen Maria I of Portugal began her reign as a deeply devout, intelligent ruler who brought education reforms and strengthened the economy. But grief and gout eventually consumed her. She lost her husband, her son, her confessor, and then, very quietly, her mind. Her breakdown wasn't theatrical, it was ecclesiastical, a slow unraveling wrapped in rosaries and howling psalms. She became obsessed with sin, her own, the nation's, everyone's. She was convinced she was damned, that God had withdrawn his grace. She screamed at night, she wailed during the day. Courtiers reported that she would suddenly collapse into fits of sobbing, crying out that she could see the souls of the damned burning in hell. She refused food for fear of poison. She banned music. Her palaces grew cold, silent, and grim. When her son died in 1788, her mind fractured. Her screams reportedly echoed through the palace halls like sirens of grief. Even her priests were disturbed. The woman who had once been hailed as Maria the Pious became Maria the Mad. Eventually, she was declared insane and removed from power, though her title remained. Her younger son João ruled as regent, while Maria paced in circles, mumbling prayers and staring at unseen demons. Portugal, during this period, tried to maintain the illusion that the monarchy was stable, but Maria was the worst-kept secret in Europe. Visitors to the court were told not to acknowledge the strange noises coming from the royal apartments. Medical advice varied from bloodletting to holy water, but nothing helped. She was eventually moved to Brazil when the royal family fled Napoleon's invasion. There, she lived in semi-confinement, still convinced she was eternally damned, still screaming, still lost. When she died in 1816, some said the silence that followed was the first peace the palace had known in decades. And while Maria feared poison, the next emperor reveled in it. Especially if the victim was too young to scream. Emperor Tiberius of Rome. There are monsters, and then there is Tiberius. When Emperor Tiberius retreated from public life to the island of Capri, he didn't retire, he metastasized. Rome's second emperor, turned the cliffs of Capri into a private kingdom of horrors, complete with grottos of depravity, orgies choreographed like military campaigns, and atrocities so grim that even his fellow Romansno strangers to indulgence were horrified. According to the historian Suetonius, who might have embellished, but not by much, Tiberius had small boys trained to swim between his legs during his baths, calling them his little fishes. He committed acts that today would not only merit criminal prosecution but international tribunals. He watched executions while sipping wine. He reportedly had people flung from cliffs for minor offenses or simply for his own amusement. His villa was a palace of nightmares. Tiberius wasn't always like this. In his early life, he was a competent general, a reluctant politician, and a man of brooding intellect. He hated politics and was often described as melancholy and reclusive. But, as emperor, isolated and surrounded by sycophants, he gave in to the darkest parts of his nature. His paranoia deepened. He abandoned Rome entirely, leaving day-to-day governance to Lucius Elias Sejanus, his trusted commander of the Praetorian Guard, who then tried to seize power himself. Tiberius responded by launching a purge so brutal it made earlier Roman reigns looked like Renaissance fairs. Torture, executions, starvation. Senators and rivals fell like flies in the Capri sun. He died at the age of 77, possibly smothered to death by his successor Caligula, or simply from illness. Few mourned, most celebrated. Rome had learned what it meant to be ruled by a man who confused solitude with sovereignty and vice with virtue. And next, we descend deeper into madness with a French king who wore padding to avoid shattering because he believed he was made of glass. King Charles VI of France, the mad. King Charles VI of France was not just mad he was made of glass, or at least that's what he believed. In one of the more fragile delusions in royal history, Charles was convinced that his body would shatter if touched. He wore padded clothes to protect his limbs. He forbade others from coming near him, fearing accidental breakage. Picture a monarch swaddled like a child in winter, ruling from within a protective shell of velvet and wool. Charles didn't start out this way. In the early years of his reign, he was known as Charles the Beloved. He was intelligent, charming, and well-liked. But by the age of 24, something cracked metaphorically at first. He suffered a psychotic episode in the middle of a forest, attacking his own knights in a blind rage. From there, it spiraled. His madness came in waves. Sometimes he thought he was St. George. Other times, he forgot he was king. He often failed to recognize his wife and children. He once fled from his own reflection. His court tried to manage the chaos, propping up regents and factions to rule in his name, while Charles wandered the halls, mumbling about shattering bones and invisible enemies. The political fallout was devastating. France fractured under the weight of his illness. Nobles vied for control. England pounced. The 100 Years' War dragged on, fueled in part by a monarch who thought his bones were crystal. He lived in a gilded prison of the mind, unable to distinguish real threats from imagined ones, real people from phantoms. Yet through it all, no one dared remove him. He was still king even if only in title, wrapped in silk and padded delusions. And speaking of delusions, the next monarch trusted his astrologer so much, he kept him as a prisoner. King Louis XI of France. King Louis XI wasn't mad, he was methodical and terrified. Known as the universal spider for the vast web of intrigue he spun across Europe, Louis ruled through manipulation, espionage, and superstition. He distrusted nearly everyone, and those he did trust, he kept on a short leash, literally. Take his astrologer, for instance. Louis consulted him constantly, relying on horoscopes and omens to guide political decisions. But when the astrologer predicted the death of a woman Louis favored, the king was incensed and curious. So he conducted an experiment. He invited the astrologer to court and asked when he would die. Sensing a trap, the astrologer replied, "Not long after, Your Majesty." Louis was impressed and afraid. He kept the man alive and, by some accounts, under watch or even in captivity for the rest of his life. Better to have your prophet where you can see him. Louis was deeply superstitious. He wore holy relics under his clothes, consulted witches in secret, and avoided unlucky dates like they were plagues. His personal wardrobe reportedly included charms sewn into the lining. But this wasn't just peasant-level mysticism, it was a policy framework. He believed that fate could be negotiated, if not entirely bribed. He rarely appeared in public. He ruled from fortified castles, often alone, sending letters like a medieval introvert with trust issues. His paranoia made him dangerous. He had nobles executed for treason without trial. He isolated himself from advisors. He created France's first organized postal system not for communication, but surveillance. Yet, despite his eccentricities, Louis was wildly effective. He consolidated royal power, broke the feudal system's grip, and laid the groundwork for France's rise as a centralized nation-state. But he never stopped fearing death, betrayal, or the stars. When he died in 1483, he was alone just the way he seemed to prefer it, behind stone walls, under lucky charms, waiting for omens that, this time, were right on schedule. And from a king who feared death, we leap to a queen who walked away from the throne entirely dressed like a man, thinking like a philosopher, and very much not interested in courtly nonsense. Queen Christina of Sweden. Queen Christina of Sweden might have been the only monarch in history who abdicated the throne with the energy of someone ghosting an entire continent. Crowned at 6 and ruling by 18, she was brilliant, rebellious, wildly unconventional, and absolutely not here for your royal expectations. Christina dressed in men's clothing, refused to marry, hated court life, and, just to really hammer in the point, converted to Catholicism and moved to Rome. Her reign began with potential. She was educated like a prince, fluent in multiple languages, and obsessed with philosophy and the arts. She surrounded herself with intellectuals, sparred with scholars, and collected more books than most universities. But she also had a restless spirit and the patience of a lit match. Governance bored her. Marriage disgusted her. Diplomacy irritated her. She once said she had no taste for the needle, sewing, no aptitude for spinning, and no love for the functions of queens. She was eccentric in every way. She would climb out of windows rather than attend boring meetings. She swore like a sailor and fenced like a man. Her courtiers were scandalized by her masculine wardrobe, her refusal to marry, and her rumored relationships with both men and women. Her close friendship with Ebba Sparra, whom she called her bedfellow, led many to suspect something deeper, and the letters between them don't exactly settle the matter. At 27, Christina dropped the mic. She summoned her council and announced she was done. No scandals, no coups, just out. She formally abdicated, left Sweden, and converted to Catholicism, shocking move for the ruler of a fiercely Protestant nation. She spent the rest of her life in Rome, hosting salons, getting into arguments with the Pope, and cultivating a reputation as one of Europe's most enigmatic ex-monarchs. She was buried in St. Peter's Basilica, the only woman interred there. A queen who refused to be queen, a woman who rewrote her story mid-paragraph, And next comes a king who dressed like a peacock, but ate like a lion, extravagant, corseted, and constantly overdressed for the collapse of an empire. King George IV of the United Kingdom. King George IV was less a monarch and more a fashion-forward catastrophe in motion. He didn't just indulge, he consumed extravagance the way dying stars consume light. By the end of his reign, he had bankrupted himself, ballooned to over 300 pounds, and become the walking embodiment of style over substance, corsets over conscience. He was the original dandy. Obsessed with his appearance, George pioneered the art of royal self-adoration. He wore corsets so tight they rearranged his internal organs, powder so thick his face looked sculpted, and coats so elaborate they needed assistants to help him exit them. He owned over 10,000 gloves and had a tailor on call for spontaneous redesigns of everything from cravats to royal robes. When he wasn't reinventing fashion, he was reinventing architecture, commissioning the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, a building so flamboyantly Eastern-inspired it looked like a Taj Mahal hallucination. But under the silk and starch was a man falling apart. George drank excessively, gambled compulsively, and indulged in an ever-expanding list of vices. His diet was epic in volume and tragic in result: multi-course meals, constant snacks, and late-night banquets, often followed by vomiting to make room for more. He had gout, dropsy, and liver failure, and that was before breakfast. His political career was mostly symbolic, but his personal scandals were anything but. He married Caroline of Brunswick in a ceremony so awkward it bordered on slapstick. He despised her on sight, and she wasn't particularly taken with him either. The marriage imploded immediately, and George spent most of his life trying to keep her out of the public eye and off the throne. Their fights became public spectacles, with pamphlets, caricatures, and courtroom dramas filling London's gossip mills. When his father, George III, descended into madness, George IV ruled as Prince Regent, a job he took as an excuse to throw even more lavish balls. When he finally became king, it was almost anticlimactic. His legacy was more stitched than written, more powdered than profound. And yet, he left behind a kingdom dressed to the neen-sand, a monarchy increasingly out of touch with the people it claimed to rule. Which takes us to a king from a very different corner of the world, Don, who installed electricity not just in palaces, but into the veins of modernization itself. King Chulalongkorn, Rama V of Siam, Thailand. While many monarchs clung to outdated traditions with fingernails dipped in denial, King Chulalongkorn of Siam embraced modernity like it was a long-lost sibling. He ruled in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and didn't just preserve his kingdom, he pulled it inch by inch out of the jaws of colonialism. But Chulalongkorn wasn't content with diplomacy and reforms. He wanted wires, light bulbs, railways, telegraphs, and clocks that ticked in sync with the West. He was obsessed with electricity both as a metaphor for modernization and as a literal, glowing force. He personally oversaw the installation of electric lights in the Grand Palace, reportedly delighting in flipping the switches himself. For a man descended from god-kings, it was a profoundly human joy. His fascination with technology bordered on the boyish. He collected gadgets, read foreign engineering manuals, and invited European specialists to train his people. Under his reign, Siam modernized its infrastructure, abolished slavery, and overhauled the legal system. He sent his children abroad to study and used photography not just for portraits, but for public relations. He understood something few monarchs did at the time. Power now lay in perception, and progress was the best armor against colonization. But it wasn't just about wires and rail lines. Chulalongkorn reshaped monarchy itself. He reduced the divine mystique around his office, presented himself as a reformer, and traveled across Asia and Europe to forge alliances. He was a spiritual man, yes, but a political realist too. Even his downtime was active. He wrote poetry, held intellectual salons, and kept meticulous notes. His favorite topic? The balancing act of modernization, how to adopt the West's tools without losing Siamese identity. He succeeded where so many others failed. Thailand, unlike most of its neighbors, was never colonized largely due to his efforts. But if Chulalongkorn electrified his kingdom, the next king electrified himself, at least emotionally, by staring up at the stars. King Christian IV of Denmark. King Christian IV had a crown on his head and constellations in his eyes. While most monarchs fought over borders, Christian fought over observations, celestial ones. He was obsessed with astronomy, not just as a passing hobby, but as a state-level passion. Under his orders, Denmark became one of the most scientifically curious courts in Europe. He wasn't a casual stargazer. Christian built an entire observatory, Rundetårn, or the Round Tower in Copenhagen. It wasn't just for decoration or political show. It was a real, working research facility where he would often climb to the top himself to study the stars, sometimes dragging court officials with him as unwilling cosmic students. He believed astronomy could guide not just ships, but souls. And this wasn't just Enlightenment showboating. Christian ruled during the early 1600s when astrology and astronomy were still cousins divorced, but visiting on weekends. He believed that the stars held divine meaning, but also scientific truth. He funded observatories, supported Tycho Brahe, and encouraged a court culture that valued learning almost as much as land. But for all his intellectual pursuits, Christian's personal life was as chaotic as a comet on fire. He loved warrant not from a distance. He personally led troops into battle, even when he probably shouldn't have. He lost an eye in one skirmish, which only added to his legend. He also lost battles, and money, a lot of it. His ambitions often exceeded his resources. He tried to insert Denmark into the 30 Years' War and failed spectacularly. He built grand cities, palaces, and naval projects that drained the treasury and left his successors scrambling. The stars inspired him, but they didn't balance his budget. Still, Christian IV remains one of Denmark's most iconic kings, intellectually curious, tragically overextended, and permanently one-eyed. He left behind a legacy carved into architecture, culture, and stone towers still pointing skyward. And speaking of dangerous obsessions, the next king combined love, scandal, and a little too much affection for his male favorites, some of whom ruled more than he did. King Edward II of England. If King Edward II had been born a commoner, he might have made a great tavern, singer, or maybe a very dramatic blacksmith. But fate made him king, and England paid the bill. Edward II is remembered less for ruling a kingdom and more for being ruled by personal affection, particularly for two men, Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser. Whether those relationships were romantic, political, or both, they scandalized medieval England and rewrote the rules of favoritism from subtle to open chaos. Edward's obsession with Gaveston started early. He showered him with titles, gifts, lands, and most explosively public affection. Gaveston was not from the right class, not from the right family, and absolutely not subtle. He flaunted his influence like a teenager with a new sports car, mocking nobles and appearing at court dressed in flamboyant colors. He was eventually exiled, then returned, then exiled again. Finally, the barons had enough. They arrested him, held a sham trial, and executed him. Edward was devastated. Enter Hugh Despenser, a man even more ruthless, ambitious, and disliked. Despenser became Edward's new favorite, and the dynamic duo ruled England through corruption, land seizures, and raw intimidation. Nobles were alienated. The Queen, Isabella of France, was enraged. Edward seemed content to delegate royal duty in exchange for romantic loyalty and flattery. It all collapsed in 1326 when Isabella invaded England with her lover, Roger Mortimer, and overthrew Edward. He was imprisoned, humiliated, and according to one very persistent rumor, murdered by the insertion of a red-hot poker into a very royal orifice. Whether or not that's true, and it probably isn't, it tells you everything about how people remembered him. Edward II's legacy isn't written in treaties or conquests. It's carved in the dangerous geometry of personal obsession, political naivete, and one very confused monarchy. Next up, a king whose idea of royal responsibility involved crop rotation and milking his own cows. King Sancho I of Portugal. Sancho I of Portugal might be the only monarch in history who ruled with a plow. While most kings of the 12th century were obsessed with war, religion, or marrying their daughters off like chess pieces, Sancho was obsessed with farming. Not as metaphor, not as a political image, as an actual lifestyle. He spent his spare time tending to livestock, inspecting vineyards, and developing irrigation systems. He kept bees, experimented with crops, and reportedly had long, deeply philosophical conversations with shepherds. Some kings built fortresses. Sancho built granaries. His enemies came with swords. He answered with seed catalogs and manure management. He earned the nickname O Povoador, the populator, because of his relentless efforts to repopulate and cultivate lands ravaged by war. He handed out land like candy, encouraged internal migration, and even offered tax incentives to families willing to settle in rural wastelands. In a feudal Europe filled with burning heretics and crusading knights, Sancho was essentially trying to gentrify abandoned cow fields. This wasn't just an eccentric side project. Sancho believed that agriculture was the foundation of national power. More fields meant more food meant more people. More people meant more taxes and more soldiers, if it came to that. His vision was centuries ahead of its time. Not everyone appreciated it. His nobility grumbled that the king spent more time with pigs than Parliament. Some even whispered that he wasn't quite sane, that he preferred sheep to strategy, but the peasants loved him. He gave them land, tools, and dignity. In return, they gave him stability. Sancho died in 1211, leaving behind a Portugal richer in wheat, wine, and actual people than when he'd found it. He might not have been a brilliant tactician or theological scholar, but he understood something most kings didn't. No empire survives on empty stomachs. And now, from a monarch of mud and hay to an empress who turned getting dressed into a 4-hour religious ceremony involving pearls, jade, and enough ritual to terrify a modern-day spa staff. Empress Cixi of China. To enter Empress Dowager Cixi's dressing room was to step into a sanctum of ritual, luxury, and psychological warfare. It didn't matter that she technically ruled from behind the screen. Every pearl she wore, every jade hairpin, every fold in her embroidered robe carried the weight of power wrapped in silk and expectation. Cixi was the de facto ruler of China for nearly 5 decades during the twilight of the Qing dynasty, and while her political decisions are hotly debated, was she a brilliant conservative or a tyrannical obstructionist? There is no debate about her command of image. Her morning dressing ritual could take 4 to 6 hours. She didn't just wear clothes, she ascended into them. Her attendants, hand-picked eunuchs and maids, followed strict protocols, specific orders of clothing, precise angles of presentation, whispered communications only. Each piece of her elaborate outfit was steeped in symbolism, prosperity, longevity, imperial authority. She reportedly had over 3,000 sets of garments and enough jewelry to rival entire European treasuries. Her meals followed similarly theatrical patterns. Dozens of dishes were prepared daily, all sampled, few actually eaten. Poison tasters always ate first. Presentation mattered more than flavor. A peach wasn't just a peach, it had to arrive with a poem carved into it, served on a porcelain dish that matched her mood. Cixi wasn't just vain, she was strategic. She understood that in a Confucian, male-dominated system that expected women to be silent shadows, appearance was speech, and hers shouted. Her court was layered with protocol, her enemies kept off balance by the constant theater of control. She was accused of being cruel and manipulative, but in reality, she played a rigged game and still bent it toward her will. She died in 1908, just before the dynasty collapsed. Her tomb was robbed, her legacy attacked by reformers, but her legend endured. The woman who never ruled officially left behind one of the most commanding footprints in Chinese history. And now, to a monarch who escaped the palace walls by heading straight up mountains, sometimes disguised, always climbing towards something no crown could reach, King Albert I of Belgium. King Albert I of Belgium didn't climb metaphorical mountains. He climbed real, one's-eye-draped, avalanche-prone, frost-bitten peaks that would have terrified most men with crowns. But Albert wasn't like most kings. He was a monarch of motion, quiet, introspective, and oddly allergic to the pampered stagnation of royal life. While other rulers attended opera galas and pored over treaties, Albert strapped on crampons and vanished into snowstorms. He was known to disguise himself as a commoner during his solo climbing trips. No guards, no fanfare. Just a middle-aged man in woolen boots scaling deadly summits like he had something to prove. Maybe he did. Belgium was a fragile nation surrounded by giants, and Albert ruled like a man aware that survival, personal and national, required both humility and nerve. During World War I, he refused to flee the country. While other leaders hid behind distant front lines, Albert led the Belgian army in person, becoming a symbol of resistance against the German invasion. His soldiers loved him. The world respected him. He wore his uniform not like a costume, but like armor sewn from moral resolve. But it was on the mountains where his soul lived. He climbed obsessively, passionately, and without theatricality. The Alps, the Dolomites, even some of the roughest parts of Belgium's own rocky terrain, he scaled them all. His wife reportedly worried that the cliffs would kill him. In the end, she was right. In 1934, Albert fell to his death while climbing solo in Marche les Dames. The exact circumstances remain unclear. Some whisper accident, others hint at suicide, but the image stuck. A king, lost to the very heights he loved. No guards, no court. Just the rock, the wind, and silence. And now, from a king who studied mountains, we turn to one who studied everything, including anatomy, astronomy, and clockwork mechanisms delivered straight from the West. Emperor Kangxi of China. Emperor Kangxi ruled for over 60 years, and in that time, he managed to make the word omniscient seem like a reasonable job description. He wasn't just a ruler, he was a scholar, god, a man who treated governance like a thesis and the Qing dynasty like a lifelong research project. He invited Jesuit missionaries to court not to convert, but to teach. He wanted maps, mathematics, anatomy charts, and clocks. Kangxi's curiosity was relentless. He didn't just want to hear about the world, he wanted to measure it, dissect it, and sometimes fix it with tweezers. He learned Latin. He studied European astronomy alongside Chinese cosmology. He merged Western calendar systems with Chinese traditions and regularly held science seminars inside the Forbidden City. Imagine a ruler who governed millions by day, then spent the evening fiddling with clock gears, asking French missionaries about the moon. But this wasn't dilettante dabbling. Kangxi applied his knowledge in statecraft. He reformed taxation using mathematical models, streamlined bureaucracy, and personally led military campaigns. He was known to ride into battle with the same mind that studied star charts, because in Kangxi's worldview, understanding the heavens helped you understand people. And yet, he never lost the Confucian framework. He held fast to tradition while reaching forward, a balancing act that helped stabilize one of the largest empires on earth. His reign was considered a golden age. Prosperity grew. Rebellions were quelled, and in the center of it all stood a man who treated Jesuit telescopes and Confucian moralism with equal reverence. He died at the age of 68, leaving behind a legacy of intellectual hunger and imperial pragmatism. His funeral was attended by both Confucian scholars and European scientists. And speaking of scholars with strange hobbies, the next Tsar ruled not just by decree, but also by dental extraction. King Peter, the Great of Russia. Peter the Great didn't just modernize Russia, practically remixed it by hand. He dragged his country, kicking and screaming, into the Enlightenment, rearranging its limbs and culture with the delicate precision of a man wielding both a scalpel and a sledgehammer, sometimes literally. Peter had a fascination with medicine, particularly dentistry. The Tsar of all the Russias liked to pull teeth from people, his courtiers, his servants. Anyone with a loose molar and the misfortune to make eye contact during a slow afternoon, he considered it a kind of civic duty. I modernize you, I extract from you. This wasn't metaphor. Peter carried dental tools with him and proudly displayed his collection of extracted teeth in jars. Visitors to his court were expected to endure an examination and perhaps an impromptu extraction if the spirit or vodka moved him. No anesthesia, just brute force and royal authority. Peter was a giant, physically and historically. He stood around 6'8", towering over most Europeans of his time, and ruled like a man determined to smash every outdated custom with his bare hands. He westernized clothing, demanded shaved beards, built a navy from scratch, and constructed a capital city, St. Petersburg, in a swamp just to prove he could. He traveled incognito through Europe during his grand embassy, studying shipbuilding, surgery, and military tactics. He worked as a carpenter in Dutch shipyards, assisted in anatomical dissections in London, and returned home more convinced than ever that Russia needed to evolve or be left behind. But evolution under Peter came at a price. His reforms were often brutal, his temper legendary. He killed his own son, Alexei, after accusing him of treason. His court was part Renaissance academy, part torture chamber. He died in 1725, reportedly after diving into freezing waters to rescue stranded soldiers. Even in death, he refused to rule from a distance. And from a king who collected teeth like medals, we now meet one who wrote sonatas, played the flute, and preferred dogs to diplomats. King Frederick, the Great of Prussia. When your father is a militaristic maniac obsessed with tall soldiers and beating sensibility into your skull, becoming a soft-spoken flutist is an act of rebellion. King Frederick II of Prussia. Frederick the Great was not born great. He was born sensitive, philosophical, and more interested in Voltaire than violence. His father, Friedrich Wilhelm I, tried to beat that out of him, literally. Frederick spent his youth secretly reading Enlightenment philosophy, writing sonatas and playing the flute in hidden corners of the palace. When he tried to flee Prussia with his close friend Hans Hermann von Katt, he was caught. His father had Katt executed in front of Frederick. It was a trauma he never fully recovered from, and it shaped his reign in paradoxical ways. As king, Frederick became both warrior and artist. He was a military genius who expanded Prussia's territory through a series of brilliantly executed wars. But when the cannons cooled, he retreated to Sanssouci, his Rococo palace where he could discuss metaphysics with Voltaire and compose music in peace. He wrote poetry in French. He designed gardens with mathematical precision. He preferred the company of his Italian greyhounds to that of his courtiers, whom he often found exhausting. His daily routine was an obsessive loop of statecraft, writing, and flute practice. He was disciplined, yet deeply melancholic. Prussian efficiency draped over a soul soaked in existential dread. Frederick never married. He had no children. His sexuality remains a subject of scholarly speculation, but most agree he had romantic feelings for men, particularly von Katt. He once said, "A crown is merely a hat that lets the rain in," and yet he wore it, with the kind of irony only a man forced to become what he despised can understand. He left behind a Prussia that was bigger, richer, and colder. An empire where music floated above gunpowder, where greatness came not from love, but from necessity. Now, from one Prussian paradox to a Swedish monarch who believed he was possessed and sometimes sculpted that belief in stone, King Eric XIV of Sweden. If you could distill mental illness into royal decree, you'd get King Eric XIV of Sweden, a monarch who saw demons in mirrors and assassins in shadows, yet thought of himself as a misunderstood genius. His reign was a slow-motion breakdown, carved into the frost of Scandinavian history. Eric was the eldest son of Gustav Vasa, and he inherited a kingdom with potential but also paranoia, instability, and a father who ruled with an iron Bible. Eric tried to differentiate himself. He was artistic, intellectual, and unusually progressive for his time. He believed in education, reduced noble privileges, and even promoted commoners to high office. But all of it unraveled under the weight of his growing madness. He believed himself possessed by spirits. He wandered the palace halls delivering incoherent speeches. He obsessed over astrology and apocalyptic predictions. He once had an entire banquet interrupted so he could interrogate guests about hidden plots he'd invented in his own head. The paranoia escalated into violence. In one of his most infamous acts, Eric personally ordered and allegedly participated in the Sture murders, a gruesome series of executions against members of the powerful Sture family, whom he believed were plotting against him. Blood soaked the palace floor, and the nobility recoiled in horror. Between breakdowns, Eric fancied himself a sculptor. He'd disappear into manic artistic binges, carving figures from wood and wax, muttering to himself as he shaped imaginary allies or invisible enemies. His court tried to manage him soothing, redirecting, sometimes drugging. It wasn't enough. Eventually, his half-brothers seized power, declared him unfit, and imprisoned him. He spent years in captivity, sometimes lucid, sometimes not. In 1577, he died under suspicious circumstances, possibly poisoned with arsenic mixed into a bowl of pea soup. His legacy is jagged, an enlightened despot undone by mental collapse, a visionary who lived too long in his own head. And now we move from Swedish visions to Japanese Versailles ruler who wielded modernity by day and calligraphy by candlelight. Emperor Meiji of Japan. The Meiji Emperor never raised a sword in battle, yet he led one of the most radical transformations in global history. He turned a feudal, isolated Japan into a modern industrial power in just a few decades. But even as railways crisscrossed the countryside and steamships docked in Tokyo Bay, Emperor Meiji clung to something softer, poetry. Known for his devotion to waka, classical form of Japanese verse Meiji, wrote over 100,000 poems in his lifetime. Most were short, reflective, and laced with the natural world. The wind blows gently, and yet the leaves of the trees per all one by one still. While his advisors drafted sweeping reforms and navy blueprints, Meiji quietly penned couplets about mist, silence, and the texture of rice fields. He was a symbol emperor bound by Shinto tradition, but he operated behind the scenes with immense influence. Under his reign, Japan adopted a constitution, established a Western-style cabinet, reformed education, abolished the samurai class, and launched an industrial boom that stunned the world. Yet he remained a deeply private man, quiet, composed, and emotionally opaque. He also practiced Shodote art of Japanese calligraphy with religious dedication. Each stroke was deliberate, every brush a meditative gesture. Unlike many monarchs of modernization, Meiji didn't abandon tradition, he infused it with purpose. Visitors to court were often surprised. They expected a rigid, formal imperial presence. Instead, they found a thoughtful, soft-spoken man who rarely spoke publicly and communicated through verse. He believed that poetry had moral value, that writing about falling snow or blooming plum blossoms could train the heart to be just. When he died in 1912, an entire era ended. His funeral was a national mourning unlike anything Japan had seen. Thousands wept not for the bureaucrat or reformer, but for the emperor who turned transition into reflection-own inked syllable at a time. And from poetic introspection, we move to a ruler whose idea of strategic thinking involved abandoning cabinet meetings to beat the AI at chess. King Prempeh I of the Ashanti Empire. When the British came knocking in the late 19th century with imperial flags and rifles polished to a shine, King Prempeh I of the Ashanti Empire met them not with armies, but with chess, literally. He was known to spend hours locked in games, often abandoning high-level state meetings just to get a few moves ahead on the board. For Prempeh, the battlefield of kings wasn't always fought with soldier. It was fought on 64 squares, in silence. This wasn't aristocratic escapism. It was strategy training. Chess wasn't just a game to him, it was a metaphor for politics, diplomacy, and survival. He reportedly kept a board near his throne and was known to challenge advisors, foreign visitors, and even rivals. In an empire where oral tradition and military prowess reigned supreme, Prempeh brought a distinctly cerebral edge. His moves, both on and off the board, were calculated. Unfortunately, calculation didn't stop colonization. As European powers carved up Africa, Prempeh found himself under pressure from the British Empire, who demanded that the Ashanti submit to British protection, a polite euphemism for surrender. Prempeh refused. He famously said, "I prefer to live and suffer rather than to consent to rule under the white man." So, in 1896, the British invaded. Rather than resist with violence, which would lead to slaughter, Prempeh ordered his forces to stand, down hoping his gesture would preserve lives. He and his family were arrested and exiled, first to Sierra Leone, then to the Seychelles. Even there, he kept playing chess. He returned to the Gold Coast years later, no longer king but still revered. He never ruled again, but his legacy endured. In Ghana, he's remembered not as a defeated king, but as a dignified one who surrendered the throne to save his people, and maybe checkmated history in his own quiet way. Now, from a king of pawns and pride, to a monarch who swapped court robes for monk robes and predicted a solar eclipse to silence the gods. King Mongkut, Rama IV, of Siam, Thailand. King Mongkut of Siam, better known to the West as the King from the King and I, which he would have hated, wasn't just a monarch, was a scholar monk with a telescope. Before ascending the throne, Mongkut spent 27 years as a Buddhist monk, mastering Pali, Sanskrit, and English. He taught himself Latin. He read Catholic theology. He corresponded with missionaries and Western scientists. When he finally became king at 47, he brought a library to the throne with him. But Mongkut didn't just read about science. He applied it. He was a man on a mission to modernize Siam without surrendering to colonial forces. So he did something no other Southeast Asian monarch had done. He used astronomy as diplomacy. In 1868, Mongkut predicted a solar eclipse to the exact date, time, and location years in advance. He invited European scientists to Siam to witness the event. When the sun disappeared behind the moon exactly as he said it would, it wasn't just a moment of cosmic poetry. It was a geopolitical mic drop. Siam, he was telling the world, was no backwater. It was enlightened with a capital E. But Mongkut's eccentricities didn't end at astronomy. He had a passion for traveling in disguise, walking among his people as a commoner. He wanted to hear the truth unfiltered, unscripted. He studied the daily lives of peasants, monks, merchants. Then he'd return to the palace and use that knowledge to tweak taxation or reform the justice system. And yes, there was the famous incident with Anna Leonowens, the British governess whose memoirs inspired The King and I. But Mongkut was not the dancing, love-struck caricature she described. He was sharp, dry, and never afraid to scold visitors for their cultural arrogance. He died shortly after the eclipse he predicted from malaria contracted during the observation. The king who saw the stars coming couldn't foresee the mosquito. And now, from a stargazing monk king to one who believed he was a unicorn's descendant and built a shrine to prove it, King George III of Hanover, Ernst August. Before you picture powdered wigs and Buckingham Palace, understand this: George III of Hanover is not George III of England. That George went mad and talked to trees. This one went somewhere stranger. Ernst August, Duke of Cumberland, later King of Hanover, believed wholeheartedly, without irony, that he was descended from unicorns. Not in the "I feel magical" way, in the documented lineage kind of way. He kept unicorn horns, actually narwhal tusks, in his private collection, swore by their healing powers, and once made a formal request to commission a genealogical study tracing his ancestry back to mythical beasts. Spoiler: no academic accepted. Ernst August ruled Hanover after the personal union with the British crown ended in 1837. While Queen Victoria took the British throne, Ernst inherited the German kingdom by virtue of Hanover's male-only succession law. What Hanover got in return was a deeply conservative monarch who banned liberal newspapers, crushed revolts, and opposed constitutional reforms. He was unpopular, rigid, and often despised by intellectuals. But then there were the unicorns. He collected unicorn iconography, obsessively paintings, sculptures, relics. His personal crest featured a unicorn, and he reportedly believed unicorns still lived in remote corners of the world. He once told a visiting noble that "the blood of unicorns runs in the veins of the House of Hanover," a phrase delivered with the seriousness of a man explaining his bank balance. Despite his eccentricities, Ernst August ruled with calculated authoritarianism. He ignored democratic petitions and tightened censorship. He was more feared than loved, and more mocked than respected. Satirical cartoons of the time often showed him riding a unicorn into battle against common sense. He died in 1851, leaving behind a legacy of repression and a horned menagerie of delusion. His son, George V of Hanover, inherited the throne, but the unicorn mythology never stuck quite the same. And next up, we journey to the Middle East where a reclusive sultan formed an orchestra, picked up a baton, and turned royal protocol into symphonic performance. Sultan Qaboos bin Said al-Said of Oman. In a palace where tradition echoed through every gilded corridor and incense-thick air whispered with centuries of rigid decorum, Sultan Qaboos bin Said al-Said decided that what Oman really needed was a symphony orchestra. A full one, with French horns and violas and timpani. And not just as a decorative display of modernity, he actually conducted it. Sultan Qaboos, who came to power in 1970 after overthrowing his own father in a British-backed coup, was a monarch obsessed with harmony in both the musical and political sense. He inherited a country that was, to put it politely, medieval. There were only a handful of schools, no paved roads, and music was barely tolerated, let alone funded. Within a decade, he had turned Oman into a modern state. Within 2, he had his own symphony, handpicked its members, and sometimes took the baton himself for private performances. He wasn't just dabbling, he was classically trained. The Sultan studied music during his time in Britain and took to the conductor's podium with the seriousness of a man directing state affairs. But it wasn't about showing off. He rarely played for the public. Instead, he treated music as personal ritual and escape, a philosophy, a form of soft power where rhythm replaced rhetoric. Under Qaboos, Oman opened itself to the world but on its own terms. He built mosques and conservatories, funded cultural exchanges, and invested in education with the same vigor he once reserved for military reform. His taste in music ranged from Beethoven to traditional Omani ballads, and his political style echoed that eclecticism: graceful, authoritative, precise. He ruled for nearly 50 years, transforming Oman into a quiet success story in a region often defined by chaos. His death in 2020 left behind a power vacuum, but also a library of musical scores annotated in his own hand. And now, from a sultan who composed symphonies to a king who composed weddings, 70 times over, King Sobhuza II of Swaziland. If you thought having one royal wedding was enough stress for a lifetime, try having 70. King Sobhuza II of Swaziland holds the Guinness World Record for the longest reigning monarch, 82 years on the throne, and a record-breaking number of wives, estimated to be more than 7 dozen. And no, it wasn't just for show. Sobhuza became king in 1899, at just 4 months old, and ruled into the 1980s. During his reign, he transformed Swaziland, now Eswatini, from a British protectorate into an independent kingdom. He also transformed the definition of royal family into something more resembling a small village. His marriages were strategic, political, and on occasion romantic. By marrying into every major clan, he created a vast interwoven network of loyalty that stabilized the monarchy through sheer biological reach. Each wife bore him children. Many, many children. Over 200 by some estimates. Royal birthdays were practically public holidays. Family dinners required megaphones and zoning permits. His children became princes, princesses, ministers, and diplomats, effectively saturating the state with his bloodline. Yet Sobhuza was no buffoon. He was politically savvy, deeply traditional, and wielded power with subtlety. He abolished the Constitution in 1973, dissolved Parliament, and declared himself absolute ruler, not with tanks or terror, but with a quiet decree wrapped in ceremonial language, and the people cheered. His polygamy wasn't without criticism, especially from the international community. But domestically it was accepted as cultural continuity, a blend of royal prerogative and indigenous tradition. Sobhuza wore leopard skins and governed with wisdom. He held court under trees, passed judgment with storytelling, and danced at national ceremonies with the energy of a man who truly believed in his own myth. When he died in 1982, the kingdom entered mourning for a man who had ruled through peace, pageantry, and prolific paternity. His son Mizwati III inherited the throne and a logistical nightmare of siblings. And now, from a king who fathered a nation to an emperor who casually walked his pet lions like someone walking golden retrievers through the garden, Emperor Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia, in the heart of Addis Ababa, behind the towering gates of Jubilee Palace, Emperor Haile Selassie. I would often stroll through the gardens with a lion on a leash. It wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't a statue. It was a living lion, padding beside him like a house cat with royal credentials. Selassie, the Lion of Judah, wasn't just leaning into symbolism, he was the symbol. He ruled Ethiopia from 1930 to 1974, presiding over one of the most complex, revered, and politically entangled monarchies in modern history. A reformer cloaked in robes of tradition, he balanced feudal nobility with modern statecraft, introduced constitutions while preserving divine right, and maintained a divine aura even as tanks rolled toward his palace. But it's the lions that always linger. They were part of the imperial menagerie, symbols of strength, continuity, and biblical prophecy. The emperor would feed them personally, speak to them, and parade them in front of foreign dignitaries as if to say, "Yes, I have a lion. No, I'm not afraid of it. And neither should you be, unless you're planning something." Selassie's eccentricities were less bizarre than strategic. He projected divine legitimacy, invoking the Solomonic dynasty that traced lineage back to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. He was called a living god by some, especially among the Rastafarian movement, who considered him the returned Messiah. But for all the myth, Selassie was deeply human. He wept when Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in 1935. He stood before the League of Nations and begged the world not to look away. "It is us today," he said. "It will be you tomorrow." No one listened until World War II proved him heartbreakingly correct. After the war, Selassie returned in triumph, but his later years were marked by rising discontent. Famines ravaged the countryside. His court, out of touch, continued dancing. Revolution came in 1974. He was deposed in a coup, imprisoned in his own palace, and later, according to some reports, mothered with a pillow. Even in death, his lions roared in memory. And now, from the emperor who walked with lions to a king who ruled with Rajon tantrum and a mouthful of rushes at a time, King Henry II of England. Some kings ruled with wisdom, some with faith. King Henry II ruled with fury hot, unfiltered, and frequently directed at the floor. If something didn't go his way, and it often didn't, Henry would hurl himself to the ground in a screaming fit, biting the rushes scattered across the floor like a toddler possessed by an ancient demon. These were not polite royal outbursts. These were full-blown foam-at-the-mouth meltdowns. The man was brilliant, educated, tireless. He rebuilt the English legal system, extended royal justice, centralized authority, and laid the bureaucratic foundation of the English common law. But he also had the emotional regulation of a storm drain. Courtiers knew when one of his tantrums was brewing. The muttering started, the pacing quickened, and suddenly the most powerful man in England would be writhing on the ground, shrieking, covered in spit and straw. He chewed carpets. He tore at his hair. He screamed like he was being tortured, though he was usually just mildly inconvenienced by a bishop or a policy delay. His most famous arguably, history's most consequential tantrum came over his nemesis-turned-martyr, Thomas Becket. Once close friends, Henry had appointed Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury, expecting obedience. What he got instead was resistance. Becket refused to let the king interfere in church matters. He defied, excommunicated, and stonewalled. Henry seethed. And then came the moment that fateful line, likely muttered in a drunken rage, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights heard it. 4 knights took it literally. They traveled to Canterbury and murdered Becket right in the cathedral. Henry was horrified, or pretended to be. He did penance in public, walked barefoot through the streets, and let monks flog him. But the stain remained. He'd ordered nothing and caused everything. Even his family life was a battlefield. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, rebelled against him. His sons' future kings themselves turned on him, over and over. By the time he died in 1189, Henry was broken, abandoned, betrayed, and still gnashing at the ground between sobs. He changed England forever, built a system that still echoes through modern law, and chewed furniture while doing it. The paradox of Henry II was this: a mind that birthed institutions and a soul that couldn't handle delay. And so we end where we began, not with logic, resolution, or clarity, but with contradiction. 49 kings and queens, each ruling empires, each lost in their own obsessions. From bear walkers to chess players, eclipse predictors to unicorn hunters, they remind us that power never makes anyone normal. If anything, it turns the weird up to 11. Because behind every crown lies a habit, behind every throne a quirk, and behind every legacy, a mystery no history book can explain.